Empires rarely announce their endings. They slip away in moments that seem ordinary at the time, unremarkable decisions that historians later mark as the precise instant when power changed hands forever. On February 14th, 2025, such a moment occurred, not with invasions or declarations of war, but with a simple trade policy announcement that most Americans barely noticed. Donald Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, treating America's largest trading partner as a security threat. In that single decision, the United States accidentally severed the economic relationship that had anchored American dominance in the Western Hemisphere for nearly a century. What followed was not the compliance Washington expected. What followed was something far more dangerous to American power. Canada said no, not just the government, but an entire civilization choosing, quietly and systematically, to build a future that no longer required American permission. History teaches us that great powers fall not from external conquest, but from the arrogance of assuming their partnerships are permanent. Rome believed the Germanic tribes would always remain suppliers and subjects. Britain assumed the colonies would forever accept subordinate status. The pattern repeats with mechanical precision. The dominant power mistakes dependence for loyalty, convenience for necessity. For 80 years, the relationship between America and Canada followed this ancient script perfectly. Canada supplied the resources. America provided the markets. Canada extracted oil, grew wheat, mined minerals. America refined, processed, manufactured. This colonial economic model worked because Canada had nowhere else to go. Every pipeline pointed south. Every trade route led through American ports. Every major economic decision required American approval. The parallels to historical imperial relationships are precise and instructive. Just as Roman provinces shipped grain, metals, and timber to the capital while importing manufactured goods at markup, Canada found itself trapped in the classic peripheral economy model. Raw bitumen crossed the border at $50 per barrel, only to return as refined gasoline at $120 per barrel. Unprocessed lumber sold for $300 per thousand board feet became finished construction materials at $800 per thousand board feet. The value extraction was systematic, legal, and seemingly permanent. This arrangement mirrored the British Empire's relationship with its dominions, the Han dynasty's control over tributary states, even the Athenian Empire's economic management of the Delian League. The dominant power provides security and market access in exchange for resource extraction rights and captive markets for finished goods. The subordinate power accepts this arrangement because alternatives appear impossible or prohibitively expensive. The Canadian public understood this relationship with quiet resentment. They watched their raw materials cross the border only to buy back finished goods at premium prices. They saw their energy exports power American industries, while Canadian communities struggled with economic stagnation. But geography seemed to offer no alternatives. The United States was the natural market, the obvious partner, the inevitable destination for Canadian resources. Trump's February tariffs shattered this geographic determinism forever. By treating Canadian aluminum and steel as national security threats, by imposing punitive taxes on energy and agricultural products, America forced Canada to confront a fundamental question that would reshape the continent. Could Canada survive economic separation from the United States? The answer, as it turned out, was not just survival, but liberation. Mark Carney understood what American strategists missed entirely. The man who had guided Canada through the 2008 financial crisis, who had served as the first non-British governor of the Bank of England, recognized that Trump had handed Canada something invaluable, an excuse to break free from economic colonialism disguised as partnership. Carney's background was crucial to understanding why Canada's response proved so devastatingly effective. Unlike the career politicians and business executives who typically manage trade disputes, Carney possessed intimate knowledge of how global financial systems actually function under stress. His experience managing the Bank of England during Brexit negotiations had taught him how economic relationships that appear permanent can be restructured rapidly when political will aligns with economic necessity. His oversight of Canada's banking system during the 2008 crisis had demonstrated how conservative preparation and patient capital allocation could transform apparent weakness into strategic advantage. Most importantly, Carney understood leverage in ways that Trump's team, despite their business backgrounds, fundamentally did not. Leverage in international economics is not about the size of your economy or the volume of your trade. Leverage is about alternatives. The party with more alternatives dictates terms to the party with fewer alternatives. America's mistake was assuming that Canada's historical dependence translated into permanent dependence. Carney recognized that 18 months was sufficient time to build the alternatives that would reverse the leverage equation permanently. Carney's response was a masterclass in strategic patience that would have impressed Sun Tzu himself. While Washington engaged in Twitter diplomacy and political theater, Canada quietly began construction of the infrastructure of independence. The $1.2 trillion sovereignty investment program announced in Budget 2025 was not deficit spending for political programs. It was the systematic construction of economic alternatives that would make American partnership optional rather than essential. The centerpiece was audacious in its simplicity. Transform Churchill, Manitoba, from a remote Arctic outpost into the most strategically valuable port in North America. The Hudson Bay Railway, on that single line of steel running nearly 1,000 kilometers from Winnipeg to the Arctic coast, would become Canada's economic lifeline to the world. Ships traveling from Hamburg to Winnipeg could save 6,400 kilometers by using Churchill rather than American ports. In an industry where margins are measured in pennies per ton, this represented a revolutionary competitive advantage. By September 2025, the first post-Panamax container ship docked in Churchill, loaded with Canadian wheat destined for Germany. The symbolism was unmistakable. Canadian resources no longer required American permission to reach global markets. The geographic chokehold that had defined North American trade for a century was broken. The market response was immediate and devastating to American interests. Canadian wheat futures jumped 23% as European buyers recognized they could source directly without American intermediaries. Potash prices, where Canada controls nearly half of global reserves, spiked 31% as companies scrambled to secure supply agreements bypassing American ports. Western Canadian select oil began trading within $3 per barrel of Brent prices, eliminating the historical discount that had transferred billions in value to American refineries. While Canada built alternative infrastructure, something equally dangerous was happening in boardrooms and government offices across the globe. Other nations watched Canada's strategy with intense interest. Australia, Brazil, South Africa, all resource-rich countries that had chafed under great power dominance, began studying the Canadian model of strategic diversification. The lesson was clear. In a multipolar world, exclusive alignment with any single power, even a friendly one, had become a vulnerability. The global response revealed how dramatically the international system had shifted since the end of the Cold War. European Union officials, still smarting from American pressure campaigns over energy independence and trade relationships, viewed Canada's successful diversification as a template for reducing dependence on both American and Chinese economic leverage. Brussels began negotiating unprecedented partnership agreements with Ottawa that bypassed traditional Atlantic Alliance structures entirely. The most sophisticated element of Canada's international strategy was its careful cultivation of what foreign policy experts began calling strategic neutrality. Unlike Switzerland's passive neutrality or Ireland's military neutrality, Canada developed an active neutrality that leveraged its resource wealth to maintain relationships with competing powers simultaneously. Canadian wheat fed both NATO allies and Chinese markets. Canadian minerals powered both American defense contractors and European renewable energy projects. Canadian energy heated both German homes and Japanese factories. This approach terrified strategic planners in Washington, who had grown accustomed to forcing allies to choose sides in great power competition. Canada's refusal to accept exclusive alignment meant that American pressure campaigns against China or Russia would no longer automatically include Canadian cooperation. If Washington demanded that Canada restrict energy exports to China, Beijing could retaliate by restricting rare earth exports to American manufacturers. The result was a delicate balance that favored Canadian interests over American preferences. Canada signed comprehensive trade agreements integrating Canadian companies into European military supply chains. Bilateral deals with Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand targeted the 700 million person Asian market with a combined GDP exceeding $4.8 trillion. Even their relationship with China was recalibrated with surgical precision, positioning Canada as a pragmatic middle power, willing to trade with all sides while serving as proxy for none. The Beijing reset was particularly instructive. Rather than choosing between American security partnership and Chinese economic opportunity, Canada negotiated a framework that allowed both relationships to coexist. Canadian agricultural exports to China resumed under long-term contracts that included dispute resolution mechanisms independent of American trade policy. Chinese investment in Canadian infrastructure projects proceeded under Canadian law with Canadian oversight. Neither relationship required the exclusion of the other, a diplomatic achievement that American foreign policy had insisted was impossible. By the end of 2025, the numbers told a story that American policymakers were only beginning to comprehend. Canadian exports to the European Union were up 34% year over year. Exports to Asia increased by 28%. Foreign investment in Canadian logistics and infrastructure jumped by 340%. Global capital was voting with its money, betting that Canada, not the United States, represented stability and growth in North America. The most telling indicator came from American border communities. Shopping malls in Bellingham, Washington, that relied on Canadian customers, saw foot traffic drop by over 60%. Hotels in Montana and North Dakota reported occupancy rates not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. The economic impact reached $4.2 billion in lost revenue in just 6 months. The tariffs designed to pressure Canada were hemorrhaging American jobs and destroying American businesses. Energy markets delivered the cruelest irony of all. Canada supplies 4.3 million barrels of oil per day to the United States, heavy crude, specifically designed for American refineries that cannot simply switch to domestic alternatives without massive retooling costs. When Trump imposed a 15% tariff expecting Ottawa to absorb the cost, he triggered an economic boomerang. American refineries passed the increased costs directly to consumers. By summer 2025, drivers in swing states were paying an additional 41 cents per gallon solely due to the Canadian energy tariff. The energy sector revealed the fundamental miscalculation in American strategy. Complex refineries in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin had been configured over decades specifically for Canadian heavy crude. Converting these facilities to process lighter domestic shale oil would require $40 billion in infrastructure investment and 18 months of downtime. The economics were brutal. Refinery operators found it cheaper to pay the 15% tariff and pass costs to consumers than to retool their entire operations. Meanwhile, Canadian producers accelerated their pivot to Asian markets with remarkable success. The Trans Mountain pipeline expansion, originally scheduled for completion in late 2025, was fast-tracked and operational by August. New export terminals at Prince Rupert began loading supertankers bound for refineries in China, India, and South Korea. Within 6 months, Western Canadian Select was trading at premium prices in Asian markets, while American refineries struggled with supply costs that made their products uncompetitive. The psychological impact on American energy executives was profound. For decades, they had operated under the assumption that Canadian producers were price takers with no alternatives to American markets. The sight of Canadian oil tankers departing Vancouver for Shanghai represented more than lost market share. It represented the end of American monopsony power over North American energy resources. Energy industry analysts began using terms like strategic catastrophe and generational miscalculation to describe the American position. Canada had not just found alternative customers. Canada had found customers willing to pay premium prices for supply security and political stability. Asian refineries, burned by previous disruptions in Middle Eastern supplies, valued Canadian reliability enough to offer long-term contracts at rates that exceeded historical American prices by 12 hours or 18%. Republican governors in Ohio and Michigan publicly broke with the administration. The American Trucking Association called the tariffs economically suicidal. When your own party's governors are calling your signature policy a disaster, you have lost control not just of the narrative, but of political reality itself. The rebellion of Republican governors represented something unprecedented in modern American politics. These were not ideological disagreements or partisan positioning. These were elected officials watching their state economies hemorrhage jobs and revenues due to federal policy decisions that their constituents could directly trace to higher prices and plant closures. Governor Mike DeWine of Ohio found himself in the surreal position of lobbying against his own party's president to save automotive manufacturing jobs in Cleveland and Toledo. Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, despite being a Democrat, found herself working with Republican business leaders to document the economic catastrophe unfolding across the Midwest. The psychological impact on American political leadership was profound and historically familiar. Just as British colonial administrators in the 1760s could not comprehend how reasonable taxation policies were generating coordinated resistance across 13 colonies, American trade officials in 2025 struggled to understand how their pressure tactics were generating coordinated Canadian independence rather than Canadian compliance. The assumption that economic leverage automatically translated into political control had been so fundamental to American foreign policy that its failure created cognitive dissonance at the highest levels of government. Internal White House documents later leaked to the Washington Post revealed the extent of strategic confusion within the administration. National Security Advisor meetings devolved into arguments over whether Canada was engaging in economic warfare against the United States or simply pursuing legitimate economic diversification. Some officials argued for escalating pressure through additional sanctions and trade restrictions. Others warned that further aggression would accelerate Canadian decoupling and potentially trigger similar responses from Mexico and other partners. The split within American foreign policy establishment reflected a deeper crisis of imperial management. For 70 years, American strategy had been built on the assumption that alliance partners had no realistic alternatives to American partnership. The NATO framework, the bilateral trade relationships, even the cultural and educational exchanges had been structured to make independence economically and politically impossible. Canada's successful diversification challenged not just American policy toward Canada, but the entire theoretical foundation of American alliance management. The December 2025 U.S. Trade Representative hearings were supposed to rubber stamp Trump's tough stance. Instead, they became a corporate revolt. Over 3 days, 147 American business leaders testified, begging the administration not to destroy trade relationships. Ford cited supply chain disruptions for $1.4 billion in losses. GM closed 2 Michigan plants due to expensive Canadian components. The American Apple Association warned that losing Canadian market access would bankrupt thousands of farms. Trade economists began drawing historical parallels that chilled policymakers who understood their implications. Lawrence Summers noted, the situation resembled the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which triggered global trade war and deepened the Great Depression. But this comparison missed the crucial difference. In the 1930s, America was building walls around the world's largest economy. In 2025, America was building walls around an economy that its neighbors no longer needed to access. As the July 2026 USMCA review approaches, the panic is visible not in Ottawa, but in Washington. Trump had viewed this date as a weapon, assuming 18 months of tariffs would bring Canada crawling to the table desperate for any deal. Instead, Mark Carney can walk into negotiations with a folder full of signed trade deals and a unified country behind him. He can look across the table and deliver the message that ends empires. We want partnership, but we no longer need permission. The United States faces a $1.6 trillion hole in its economy if USMCA collapses. Half of that trade involves intermediate goods that fuel American manufacturing. Unlike Canada, the United States has spent 18 months alienating partners rather than building alternatives. The mathematics are brutal for American negotiators. They need the deal more than Canada does, and everyone in the room knows it. What we are witnessing is not just a trade dispute. It is a historical correction that has been decades in the making. For too long, Canada accepted the role of resource colony, shipping raw materials south and buying back finished goods at premium prices. The pandemic showed the vulnerability of that model. Trump's tariffs provided the political justification to break free from it permanently. The infrastructure being built today is permanent. The trade relationships being forged are sticky. Even if a future American administration offers to return to the old arrangement, the diversification will not simply reverse itself. The Canadian executive, who spent 2 years developing relationships in Vietnam, will not abandon them for the convenience of American buyers. More importantly, trust has been broken. In international relations, trust is the most valuable currency. When you treat a partner like an enemy, when you weaponize economic relationships for political theater, you do not get to simply reset the relationship when it becomes convenient. You have taught your partner that dependence on you is dangerous, that alternatives are necessary, that loyalty is a luxury they can no longer afford. Canada has proven that a middle power, armed with smart strategy and patient execution, can reshape the balance of an entire continent. The quiet neighbor to the north, which had been content to remain in America's economic orbit, has been pushed into building its own gravitational field. Other nations watch this transformation and ask themselves whether they too might benefit from reducing their dependence on American markets and American goodwill. The irony is profound and historically familiar. In attempting to make America great again by reducing dependence on foreign nations, Trump has actually increased American vulnerability by creating a more independent Canada. The United States now finds itself economically dependent on a country it chose to treat as an adversary. This is how empires end, not with conquest or collapse, but with the quiet recognition that their partnerships have become optional. The pattern is as old as recorded civilization and as predictable as gravity. When the Roman Senate demanded excessive tribute from the Gallic tribes, it accelerated the development of Germanic political unity that eventually sacked Rome itself. When the British Parliament imposed taxation without representation on the American colonies, it transformed 13 separate economic entities into a unified independence movement. When the Soviet Union demanded absolute loyalty from Eastern European satellites, it guaranteed that those satellites would seek Western partnership the moment opportunity arose. Each imperial power believed its dominance was permanent, its relationships irreversible, its leverage unlimited. Each discovered too late that pushing partners beyond their tolerance point transforms dependence into resistance, compliance into defiance, and subordinates into competitors. The dominant power's greatest strength, its ability to impose costs on others, becomes its greatest weakness when others develop the capacity to impose costs in return. Canada's transformation represents more than the end of American economic dominance in North America. It represents the emergence of a new model for middle power strategy in a multipolar world. Countries that control critical resources no longer need to choose between great power patrons. They can leverage their assets to maintain relationships with multiple powers simultaneously, playing competing interests against each other while preserving their own strategic autonomy. This model is already being studied and adapted by other middle powers. Norway is expanding energy partnerships with Asia while maintaining European relationships. Australia is diversifying beyond traditional American and British markets toward India and Southeast Asia. Brazil is leveraging agricultural exports to build relationships across all major economic blocs simultaneously. The Canadian precedent has shown that strategic patience and economic diversification can transform apparently weak positions into positions of relative strength. The implications for American grand strategy are sobering. For decades, American foreign policy operated on the assumption that economic integration created political leverage. The more trade, investment, and technological cooperation America developed with partners, the more influence America would have over their policy decisions. Canada's successful decoupling suggests that integration without mutual respect creates vulnerability rather than leverage. Partners who feel exploited will eventually develop alternatives, and those alternatives may prove more attractive than continued subordination. History does not punish intentions, it only records outcomes. By the time the full implications of February 14th, 2025 are understood, they will no longer matter, the moment will have passed, the decision will have been made. And the 80-year American dominance of North American trade will be remembered as another example of how great powers, in pursuit of short-term political advantage, accidentally teach their allies that independence is not just possible, but necessary. The pattern repeats with mechanical precision across centuries and civilizations. The empire that believes itself indispensable discovers it has become dispensable. The dominant power that treats partnership as subordination finds itself facing partnership between equals, or no partnership at all. Canada has chosen its path. History will record whether America can adapt to walking beside a partner rather than ahead of a subject. The early indicators suggest that adaptation will prove more difficult than American leaders imagine.